I'm happy to introduce Dr. Yaron Senderovicz from the Department of Philosophy here at Tel Aviv University. Again, I feel very fortunate to have met him several years ago. We were both nominated by the university to run the studies of consciousness of the Faculty of Life Sciences. And we were forced at the beginning to interact, and out of it grew both an intellectual and a personal friendship, which I cherish. It's not often that you get a friend at the age of 80, close friend. Yaron is an expert on the philosophy of mind, on German idealism, and on phenomenology. And he will describe his impression of about the movement notation and the method we use and our work.
Thank you, Ilan. One of the first passages of Aristotle's Metaphysics, the great Greek philosopher, is the following passage. For it is owing to their wonder that men both now begin and at first began to philosophize. They wonder originally at the obvious difficulties and advance little by little and stated difficulties about the greater matters. And a man who is puzzled and wonders thinks himself ignorant. Therefore, since they philosophize in order to escape from ignorance, evidently they were pursuing science in order to know, and not for any utilitarian end. I cannot think of a better way to begin my talk for the celebration of my friend and colleague Ilan Golani's birthday, 18th birthday, than these ancient and eternal words. Ilan Golani is, to be sure, a modern scientist, one of the best living ethologists. Nevertheless, he is, I believe, a classical scientist, driven by the sense of wonder that marks the beginning of an authentic attempt to know nature. In contrast to so many other scientists, he guards this sense of wonder as his most precious vantage point. Indeed, wonder, qua the mood of science, is not a cognitive ground that distances oneself from one's object of inquiry. It rather allows one to be immersed in it, to be imbued with the awareness of unity with it. Aristotle describes the other affective facet that underlies the desire to know as follows. All men by nature desire to know. An indication of this is the delight we take in our senses, for even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for themselves. Again, these words seem to express what motivates Ilan Golani's practice of science, what inspires his painstaking scientific research activities. It is a delight one takes in observing nature carried out from within a humble stance that honors knowledge as a gift that nature endows upon the knower. Ilan's scientific work strives, I believe, to comprehend this sense of unity of nature and mind that harmonizes also the personal and scientific life. Scientists indeed shy away from explicitly endorsing this kind of motivation. It is never explicitly expressed in the formulations of scientific theories, not even when life is the object of inquiry. Ilan is quite aware of this primordial implicit motivation. Although discussing the role of this kind of motivation in the search of scientific knowledge is not the topic of my talk today, singling it out helps, I believe, to clarify the underlying reasons that motivate Ilan Golani's unique scientific position. My main concern here will not be with the details of Ilan Golani's scientific approach in ethology. I am not a biologist, but rather with what one can describe as the image of knowledge that characterizes his approach. It has, I believe, invaluable interdisciplinary significance. For more than 6 years, we directed together the interdisciplinary program for the study of consciousness. In many personal conversations, Ilan often described his view as inspired by the philosophical work of the phenomenologist, and in particular by Merleau-Ponty. In what follows, I will try to characterize how the investigations of animals and animal behaviors that uses the Eshkol-Wachman movement notation qua methodological tool, the presupposition of the Umwelt as a background, and the other features of Ilan's ethological research program indeed intersect with phenomenology. I cannot fully present all the relevant issues in the present context. In particular, I will not be able to address here the way in which the search for homologies in behavior reflects homologies in other levels of the organism. One can characterize Ilan's approach as a distinctive type of an explanation of behavior as embodied and embedded. I will limit myself to describe its significant advantages by briefly examining its place in current philosophy of mind. I will first single out some philosophical reasons that support the embedded view. I then will clarify how embodiment figures in the phenomenological account of the mind, and how Ilan Golani's use of the Eshkol-Wachman movement notation reflects similar ideas. One can begin to survey the advantages of the embodied and embedded view by examining two competing positions in current philosophy of mind. The first position is what is often described as internalism. Please note that the meaning of this term in philosophy differs from its meaning in biology. In traditional armchair psychology, inner states were conceived as states accessible, if they are accessible, only to the reflecting subject that has them. This view emerges with Descartes' metaphysics and rational psychology. In the beginning of the 20th century, several philosophers endorsed a logical behaviorist approach to the mind. Behaviorists normally reject the idea of an inner state in the explanation of behavior and action. In their view, an inner state that cannot be publicly observed has no place in the philosophical and the scientific account of the mind. Nevertheless, due to some powerful philosophical arguments and possibilities revealed by the computer sciences in the second half of the 20th century, logical behaviorism was replaced by functionalism in the philosophy of mind. The main idea that underlies functionalism is the identification of a mental state with a functional state that is characterized by the causal role the state has in a network of states having causal roles. The most popular version of functionalism is what is often called machine functionalism, which is a view that identifies the causal role of the state with a computational state. The term machine refers in this context to Turing machines. In contrast to the behaviorist approach, functionalists acknowledge the role of an internal state in the explanation of behavior. They view the organism as a machine that receives input from the perceptual mechanism which it computes by means of its internal states and inner sources of information. What results from this process of computation causes the behavior of the organism. It is important to note that functional state is an abstract entity defined by its place in a network of similar states. Each state is identified by what it causes and how it is caused. Take, for example, my belief that it is raining today. This belief is caused, say, by the fact that I see that it is raining outside. My desire not to get wet is another state I entertain. According to the functionalist, the belief and the desire are inner cognitive states of the behaving creature. According to the functionalist, other conditions being equal, the belief that it is raining outside and the desire not to become wet cause my behavior of taking the umbrella when I go out. The fact that each node in the network of causes and effects and the functional network as a whole is an abstract entity, in fact means that the physical realization of the mental state is an additional feature of the state. By this, one in particular means that the functional state and the network of functional states as a whole are multiply realizable. This means that any physical entity that exhibits the same network of causal roles realizes the functional system. A given physical realization, say a biological realization of the functional system, is, according to this view, just one possibility of physical realization. In other words, according to the idea of multiple realizability, a functional description of an organism O that characterizes the causal computational roles of its perceptual states, its internal states, and its behavior is in principle realizable by any physical system N that has different physical properties. Although O and N have different physical properties, they nevertheless realize the same functional network. If they exhibit the same network of causal roles, O could be a biological entity, while N is not. One of the most significant attacks on the sufficiency of the functional account of cognition and behavior is due to Hilary Putnam's seminal article, The Meaning of Meaning, and related writings. Putnam was, in fact, one of the founding fathers of functionalism in the philosophy of mind. Nevertheless, he himself presented a sophisticated and powerful objection to the sufficiency of the functional account of cognitive states, qua an account of the content of mental states. A similar objection was independently presented by Saul Kripke and was developed by Tyler Burge and many other philosophers. Externalism about content is a view accepted by the majority of current philosophers of mind. Let me just say that content is a very important notion. In philosophy, this is what, in fact, determines inferential relations, intentional relations. In fact, any kind of access that we have to the world is determined by the content that mental states possess. And content is not necessarily something that is endowed by men only. Of course, it is part of the living, of any entities that can refer to anything in the world, be it a living organism or a computer. I cannot provide here the technical details of the externalist objection to internalism, and I will merely characterize the general idea that underlies it. To remind you, according to the functionalist, a state is defined by its causal role. A perceptual state, for example, is identified by the way in which it is caused by a feature in the environment and by the way in which it causes perceptual beliefs. Say that I believe that there is water in my surrounding. Say that I believe this because I perceive a clear liquid that flows in the river that has the overt appearance of water. Having the appearance of water means that the liquid that flows in the river causes in me a perceptual belief that is similar to a perceptual state caused by water. Just a minute. This is the appearance of its color, its fluid character, and its other overt characteristics that philosophers depict as phenomenological are similar to the phenomenological perceptual characteristics that are caused in one if one has perceptual contact with water. The clear liquid that flows in the river that I see with my eyes cause in me the belief that water flows in the river. Say that I'm thirsty, that I desire to drink water. Since I believe that water flows in the river, and since I desire to drink water, I walk to the river in order to drink what I believe is water. This is, in broad outlines, the functional analysis of the representational character of my perception, my perceptual belief, and my behavior. However, it is not hard to imagine a case in which the liquid that flows in the river has the overt appearance of water, but is not the chemical stuff H2O. It is rather a different stuff, XYZ, that has an overt appearance that resembles water. The truth conditions of the belief that the stuff that flows in the river is H2O clearly differ from the truth conditions of the belief that the stuff that flows in the river is XYZ. As Putnam noted, if the internal functional state is insensitive to the differences between H2O and XYZ, and if one supposes, as one should, that the content of these states cannot be neutral with respect to differences between H2O and XYZ, the functional characterization of beliefs, desires, and behavior cannot be considered a sufficient characterization of them. It is important to note that the fact that cognitive content cannot be neutral with respect to these differences does not mean that the creature that perceive and behave must possess gigantic representational systems that is able to discern every stuff from every other stuff merely on the basis of the internal states it possesses. It rather means that the stuff in the world must determine the content of the cognitive state. It means, in Putnam's words, that meanings aren't in the head. There is indeed a facet of meaning that is in the mind, that is internal, what Putnam calls narrow content. Nevertheless, a full characterization and explanation of cognition and behavior must characterize the creature as embedded in a natural environment. It must characterize it as interacting with a given environment, as taking part in a given world, and not as a wordless entity that can be characterized without reference to any environment. Although he does not discuss it explicitly, he does not discuss explicitly these issues, Ilan Golani's approach in ontology presupposes, I believe, the view that cognition and behavior characterize content or meaning as embedded in this sense. And I think that this is an intuition that Ilan had from the very beginning, even without knowing all these kinds of arguments that were already in place in philosophy. And this is a great merit. The characterization of cognitive content as embedded is, however, just one facet of the phenomenological account of content. An account of the organism as being in the world, to use the phenomenological way of putting this, does not end up here. The phenomenological way of putting this does, the account of cognition as embedded does not suffice for the account of it as embodied. As Merleau-Ponty has shown, an explanation of the movement of the behaving and perceiving organism must involve the supposition that it is embodied. Here also I cannot provide the detail of the failure of this in this context. Let me just note that the enactivist approach in the cognitive sciences and neurosciences is one current scientific approach that is explicitly influenced by Husserl, by Merleau-Ponty, and by the other phenomenological theories. Golani's ethological approach developed it in a similar but a unique way. His use of the Eshkol-Wachman movement notation, a methodological tool, together with the presupposition of the Umwelt, is a clear indication of this. The notion of the Umwelt emerged in Jakob von Exkel's biological works. Heidegger, the most important phenomenologist after Husserl, explicitly borrowed it from von Exkel. It serves a pivotal role in his existential phenomenology and in those that followed him, and in particular Merleau-Ponty's account of perception and behavior. In his ethological work, Golani brings the concept of the Umwelt back to its biological sources, I think. The fact that he combines it with an ingenious use of the Eshkol-Wachman movement notation is, I suggest, a clear indication of the affinity of his ethological approach with the phenomenological conception of cognition and behavior. One can discern here 2 points of similarity. As noted before, phenomenologists such as Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty believe that an account of the world itself is required for characterizing the cognitive state of behaving creatures. The basic concept of the Eshkol-Wachman movement notation seems to presuppose this. The notion of the base of support of the body, of the law of heavy and light limbs, and the heavy and light limbs hierarchy are inexplicable without presupposing the Earth's center of gravity. Sensitivity to the center of gravity is not possible if one does not suppose that the moving creature is embodied, but that is a being that exists in the world as being capable of moving in it. The creature's world, however, is an Umwelt. It is a meaningful world. The meaningfulness of the world, of the characteristic of the particular environment in which one lives, enters the cognitive content of the state of the behaving animal and the account of its movement. As Golani acknowledges, one cannot base this merely on what the Eshkol-Wachman movement notation affords. As far as I know, his current scientific concern is to address the way in which being in allocentric space, that is, this feature of the creature's being in the world, affects its behavior. This is also where I found the closest affinity between Golani's approach to enotology and the classical phenomenological approach to cognition and behavior. Interestingly, it is yet to be developed, and I hope that Golani's future scientific activity will be able to accomplish this. Just 1 minute. Accomplishing this seems to go hand in hand with what inspires Golani's personal and scientific long and fruitful activity. It is the craving for unity that overcomes the alienation of the scientist's mind and its object of inquiry, the world in which she lives. It is not unity achieved by abolishing one side of the equation. It should rather be conceived as an enlightened unity of a living mind that knows life itself as it is in itself. I wish Ilan a long and fruitful scientific personal life. May you continue to enlighten us in your future scientific activity. Thank you, Ilan.
תודה לירון.